I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement here with Robert Perry, and today we are talking about a very important and timely subject, and that is war and what the Course has to say about it. Before we get into the subject matter, I do want to say that we have a series of events coming up here in 2020, and I want to share them with you. The first is a day-long workshop on prayer and meditation in London that Robert is hosting in March. We have the Community Miracle Center conference in May in LA, where Robert and I will be doing a presentation on vision. Really looking forward to that. In June, Robert, you are leading a weekend workshop on guidance in St. Louis. In June, I'm also co-hosting a workshop with Corinne Zupko in New York City. Actually, I'm excited about this. I can officially announce that the Circle is hosting a workshop in September in Sedona, Arizona. And we are also doing another presentation, although separately, but we're at the same conference in October/November, late October, early November, in England at the UK Miracle Network conference. So all of those events are online at circleofa.org/events, and it's going to be a busy year.
Yeah, it will be.
But we're really looking forward to being on the road and to seeing everyone. So if you are in the area, or even if you're not, come on out. So, Robert, today we are talking about a very important subject. And so if anyone wants to follow along with this conversation, you can visit circleofa.org/15. Robert, we have a very, very complex relationship with war, don't we? I think as individuals, we find war to be reprehensible, and yet as nation states, we seem to always be ready and prepared to go to battle. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, I am too. It's such an important topic. I think that complex relationship is within each one of us, because we do have that reaction to war that's negative. At the same time, we may have served in the military. We may have relatives that served, even died in the military, and we tend to be, each one of us, on both sides of this.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We honor soldiers as we should, and at the same time, I think all of us wish that they wouldn't have to go to battle.
Yeah, and in talking about this topic, I think we should just preface it by saying we're trying to present the views of the Course here, and they are extremely unconventional views. They are not going to align with all kinds of mainstream attitudes towards war, and we may even find those views offensive. But our goal here is just to pass on what the Course is teaching.
So where do you want to start?
I think the best place to start is to kind of set the Course within a larger context. And from my standpoint, that larger context is the mixed attitudes towards war and violence in the world's great religious traditions and even in contemporary spirituality. So on the one hand, you have a lot of war and war imagery in the great religions. You have it in the Old Testament, you have it in Islam, you have it in Christianity, and you even have it in contemporary spirituality, because there we all tend to associate martial arts, for instance, with spirituality. There's the self-discipline, the self-mastery involved. There's being in tune with, invisible forces of nature, accessing hidden powers within the self. And yet martial, the word means of or pertaining to war. That's what the word literally means. So there is this whole violent, warlike side to religion and spirituality.
Yeah, and it is interesting. I've always thought that the Bible was so violent in its imagery, and yet one of the commandments is thou shalt not kill. I think you see a lot of these juxtapositions on war in traditional religions of all kinds.
Yeah.
We romanticize the martial arts, and yet it is at its core violent.
Right. Right. And then there's a spectrum with the martial arts, on the one end is Aikido, where you aren't traditionally supposed to hurt the other person. But still, it's martial, right? And we can't really get around that key word. On the other hand, there is this second stream in religion and spirituality of pacifism and nonviolence. It's there. It's a major presence.
Mm.
For instance, Jesus taught nonviolence in the Gospels, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount. And then there's the principle, the really key virtue in Indian religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism of ahimsa, which is inspired by the premise that all living beings have a spark of the divine in them. So don't harm them.
Mm. Yeah, the
And
Quakers felt that too.
the Quakers have traditionally been pacifists. So, the whole nonviolence element in the Gospels, that was brought back into prominence first by Leo Tolstoy in his later works, and that got picked up by Gandhi, and that led to Gandhi's focus on nonviolence, which is not just rooted in ahimsa, but also in the Sermon on the Mount. And that led into civil rights movements in the U.S. And so that whole stream of pacifism and nonviolence in religion is there, and it's been there, and it exists in a kind of a tension with the traditional elements of violence and warfare in religion.
Yeah, you're right. If you look close enough, actually, you don't have to look all that closely at all. You see both streams very prominently all throughout religion and all throughout all kinds of different traditions.
And it reminds me that there's religion as a countercultural force, and there's religion as a conventional force that upholds the existing order. One side tries to sort of undermine the existing order and redeem it, and the other side upholds it, and both sides are there.
Yeah, they both exist at once within the same framework.
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of setting the table for the fact that the Course is distinctly of that second stream, nonviolence and pacifism. There's no pro-war teaching in the Course, and there's not even a shred of pro-war imagery.
And yet it mentions war quite frequently.
Yeah, so I've just completed, as you know, a fairly lengthy study on war in the Course. I've got some stats here.
Yeah, I should have mentioned this is going to be a two-parter podcast.
This will be a two-part just because there's so much to say, and it's such an important topic. So, yeah.
And it's a timely topic. It's always a timely topic, but there's been a drumbeat of war, unfortunately, in the news. And so it'd be nice to know what the Course's stance is on it so that we can use that in our conversations on current events.
That's true. Okay, so I count, this is in the CE, of course, 69 references to war, wars, warring, warlike, and warriors. And then 47 references to battles, battleground, etc. There's a good deal of war imagery, including 2 extended discussions that feature the imagery of an army or a battleground. There are numerous references to weapons, arms, swords, spears, shields, armor, guns, and knives. And there are numerous really interesting and telling cultural references to World War II, the Vietnam War, movies and books about war. And through all these references I've just mentioned, an overall perspective on war emerges that I find really interesting and a bit unexpected.
A lot of that material was cut in previous editions of the course, right?
Not that much. Not that much. Some. The World War II reference was cut. The Vietnam War reference was really fleeting. I'll talk more about that. It was in Helen's notes, and she herself, I think, was directed to cross that out for obvious reasons that I'll mention. The movie references to movies and books mostly stayed in. The Don Quixote reference was taken out. But most of this, yeah, it's there in the familiar FIP edition.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive into what that overall perspective is. First, war in the Course is the single principle behind the separation. It's a principle that takes many forms and can be talked about in different ways. Okay, so you can talk about it as war versus peace versus peace, hate versus love. There's different ways to talk about it, but talking about the separation as based on war is one of the ways the Course talks about the separation.
Yeah, we had talked in our inequality podcast about inequality being at the heart of the separation, and what is war if not trying to be above? And so that ties in with that inequality discussion as well.
It does. Yeah. In fact, there's a quote that is in the CE, and it wasn't in the FIP, from chapter 3, section 6, where he says, wars arise when some regard others as if they were on a different level, meaning a lower level, obviously. All interpersonal conflicts arise from this fallacy. So all wars, and he's talking about literal wars here, and interpersonal conflict, they all arise from what he'll later call specialness. And later he'll associate specialness with both the beginning of the separation and the root of all warfare. So it's the same idea early in the text and later, that the attempt to be above others is the root of all conflict and all war.
What a powerful passage, because the second sentence says all interpersonal conflicts arise from this fallacy, and then those interpersonal conflicts are what ultimately rise to the level of war.
Right. I mean, war is just a conflict between two groups of persons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not different in print. And in fact, that's my next point.
All stemming from how we view one another.
Right. And wanting to be above.
Mm-hmm.
So this basic principle takes many forms, and you see this throughout the Course. So it's not just war with other nations. It's also war against others on the interpersonal level, interpersonal conflict. It's also war within the psyche. Early on in the text especially, Jesus emphasizes that the psyche has different levels to it, and those levels are essentially at war with each other. They don't understand each other, and so they're in conflict.
Right.
So our mind is a battleground.
Right. So we have interpersonal conflict, but before it gets to the interpersonal level where we're conflicting with other people, we have intrapersonal conflict where we're fighting in our own mind, fighting with ourselves in our own head.
Right. And he says that it has to be intrapersonal before it can be interpersonal,
Mm-hmm.
oddly enough. And then a lot of the passages about war are about war with God. So there's one principle that just takes all these different forms, and it pervades our world internally and externally because it was how the world started.
That is so interesting. At
It
the
is.
very heart of the separation is this idea of being above, which we've talked about a lot on this podcast, but look at the effect of it when it runs amok.
Right. Right. So given that that's the core, one way of talking about the core principle of the separation and the ego, all of our choices from the Course's standpoint are between war and peace. Every choice we make, whether we realize that's the choice or not, are really between those two alternatives.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Another point I think we should make from the Course's standpoint is that because war was really the genesis of this world, it's the normal state of the world. The Course calls the world a place of war in the Manual for Teachers.
Well, history certainly bears that out, doesn't it?
I think history bears that out, but it's not. We have to think it goes beyond warfare as we think of it. It has to do with war at work, with friends, in our homes. When we say it's a jungle out there, I just looked this up today. An online definition of "it's a jungle out there" is the world is characterized by ruthless behavior and competition.
Yeah, I know we've spent some time talking about the ways in which we want to say, well, war is a terrible thing and put it at the feet of someone in power. We've had this discussion about the ways in which we tend to do that to shield ourselves from our own responsibility and the ways in which these things are going on in our own minds. But I think you're right. It's a really, really important point to think about that the wars that we're seeing play out throughout history start with all of these little conflicts in our own minds, in our own homes, in our own jobs. And the course itself started with Helen and Bill's toxic work environment. They were at war in their own department.
With each other, in their department, with other departments, with other medical centers. They were on a battlefield without boundaries. And that was the whole genesis of the course. We could disband all the world's armies and the world would still be a place of war.
It's a terrifying thought.
Yeah. But when you think about it, I mean, I grew up thinking, the way the world works is basically fair and orderly and just. And then occasionally someone like breaks the rules. But why would they do it? They get caught and they get paraded before us on the news. And those little violations happen, but they're caught. And what you learn as you get older is basically it's a big knife fight. And the rules get bended and broken all the time by the winners.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not this orderly thing. It is a jungle out there. And the longer I think one lives, the more one learns that in the end, deception, ruthlessness, bullying, and outright violence end up being acceptable tools that the winners use to become winners and essentially rule the world. It's not like the people who do those things get caught and are punished and marginalized. It's the way the world works.
Unless you align yourself with that second stream of peace and nonviolence.
Right. Right.
So you got to pick this up, Robert. So where
okay.
from here?
Well, we're, in episode 1, we're really doing the course's diagnosis of war. And then in episode 2, we're going to cover, the prescription for how we should be and how we should respond. So this first episode is going to be basically a downer.
Yeah. Great. Well, I do think it's a really important point for people to understand that we look at war in these massive global terms and the wars that have been fought throughout history. And it is up to us to look at what's going on in our own minds and the way that we are propagating this in our own lives.
Right. Because that's, in the end, that's what matters most. If all the wars stopped, we would still have the interpersonal warfare that's taking place all over, in every home, in every workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So all the warfare that we've seen throughout history is just a reflection of what's going on an interpersonal scale.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the big point that I want to get across, and this kind of, I collected all those passages and categorized them and summarized them. And what grew out of that whole mass of war references was, in the end, a single, really simple idea. And it's slightly surprising, but when you think about it, it's probably not. When I think about pacifism and nonviolence, I think about, well, that's a counter to the evils of war. That's based on a view of the evils of war. And yet, the course's references and passages and teaching, they aren't really about the evils of war. They're about the senselessness of war. And that just comes through in so many places and in so many different ways. And once you see that his big point is the senselessness of war, you see he's injected it into every tiny reference.
Yeah, I see you've got a few of them here in the discussion guide.
Yeah. There's too much really to
read a couple.
Cover. Yeah, okay. So I've got a lot of categories, each with its own quote or quotes. First of all, probably his biggest point is that it's senseless because there's no gain in it only loss. Now, we only embark on war because we think the gains will outweigh the losses. We know there'll be losses, right? People will die, cities may be destroyed, uh, but the gains are so important that it's worth it. But this is the very thing that he consistently tries to undercut, that there is any gain there. So, for instance, in chapter 5, section 3, he says, war is division, not increase. No one gains from strife. And then he quotes the Gospels, what profiteth a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?
Well, I'm sure that there are a lot of listeners who are thinking, okay, well, what about the gain of American independence in the Revolutionary War? Or what about the gain of preventing the world from becoming Nazi in World War II? I mean, those seem like gains. What about the gains of stopping ISIS from spreading throughout the Middle East?
Yeah,
Those appear to be gains. So, what would you say to a
I
listener
know,
who's
I know.
thinking
Well, this is a difficult issue to confront.
the gaining of freedom for slaves in the Civil War, the American Civil War? I mean, there's
I mean, I watched the movie The Darkest Hour, where Winston Churchill basically, from the view of history, from what I can see, he had it right. The Nazis had to be absolutely opposed.
mhm.
If he hadn't done that, we might all be Nazis now. So
Yeah.
these are not easy questions. I think my answer is, let's first just acknowledge that the course is anti-war. Um, and then let's keep thinking about it, kind of like Gandhi did. I mean, he didn't just say, don't do war. He had another alternative, a way to change society and to change international relations, that had not just to do with refraining from active violence, but it also had to do with actively engaging in promoting love. And
Mhm.
so I don't think Gandhi's exact means would be the means the course would choose, um, even though I think there'd be similarities. But I think the point is the course would have us, I would guess, replace the violence with something else that was active, that was actively expressing love. And we would rely upon that active expression of love to accomplish things in the world, and then see that as more effective than accomplishing things through warfare. So I think it's not just, we don't do it and that's that.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So he makes the point that it just brings fear, that there's no safety on a battleground. And I don't know where to dive in here. So I'll read through the categories and maybe you can decide if you want to dive in further.
I want to dive in further to all of them.
I know. It's just, well, they have a 4-hour podcast. Okay. He says, hope of peace cannot be found upon a battleground. It has been hopeless to attempt to find the hope of peace upon a battleground. And then freedom's another thing we hope to gain through war, right? And one of the most important references in the course to this whole issue, it did get edited out in the FIP, but it's in the CE. It's a reference to FDR's The Freedoms. And if you know the story behind the Four Freedoms and what FDR, the argument he made with them, then this becomes a hugely important instance of the course addressing war.
Why don't you talk about the freedoms, the four
Okay.
freedoms, and what they are?
Yeah. So FDR put forward this deeply humanitarian vision, which the course definitely approves of, and I'll read the passage soon, in which he said that there were these four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. And the fear, I think, was fear of aggression from neighboring countries.
And these
Uh,
freedoms were so much a part of Americana that Norman Rockwell did a series of paintings on them.
yeah. So in an earlier era, especially, this is only 20 years after, FDR died. So I think they would have been more well known back in the mid 60s. I didn't know about them until I poked around on the internet, like, what's the freedoms? But it turns out they're very famous and well known. So, and then FDR said that, we should have established these freedoms in our country and in the world, but the main impediment to establishing these freedoms is the tyrants, the dictators, who want to impose their order on the world in which those freedoms would be gone. And so his argument for going into World War II had a great deal to do with the freedoms. And we look back on that and we see it as the just war, because what would have happened if we let Hitler, take over bit by bit by bit, and then by the time he'd reached our country, he had armies from all these countries he just conquered. We'd be Nazi.
Yeah. And yet there's just something inherently contradictory about fighting for freedom.
I know. So let's dive into this passage. This is from chapter 7, first section, paragraph 5 in the CE, and it's so important. He says, "You have probably heard many arguments on behalf of the freedoms, which would indeed have been freedom if man had not chosen to fight for them." Now, my goodness, he's upholding that humanitarian vision of the freedoms in one breath, and in the next breath, he's denying what FDR wanted to do with that vision, which is we have to go to war to make it happen. And I'm conflicted about that. What would have happened without World War II? But anyway, he's not mincing any words here. This is, if you know what he's talking about, you know what he means. That is why they perceive the freedoms as many instead of one. So he's saying the freedoms are really one, but because we associate them with warfare, it splinters them in our minds into many. We don't really see them for the one freedom they are. But the argument that underlies the defense of freedom is perfectly valid. So he's saying arguing on its behalf is valid because it is true. It should not be fought for, but it should be sided with. Those who are against freedom believe that its outcome will hurt them, which cannot be true. But those who are for freedom, even if they are misguided in how they defend it, like don't defend it by fighting for it, defend it by siding with it, are siding with the one thing in this world which is true. Whenever anyone can listen fairly to both sides of any issue, he will make the right decision. This is because he has the answer. Conflict can indeed be projected, but it must be intrapersonal first. The last sentences, I think, are pretty complicated, and I don't want to go into them too much. But the basic idea here is he's saying this is the right vision, although it'd be great if you got that it was really one freedom, one all-encompassing freedom. But in service of it...
Can you just say in what that one freedom is for listeners who maybe weren't paying attention?
Well, I think that's the Course's view of freedom, which is a state in which your will gets to express, fully without impediment, a state in which you are free from fear and guilt and worry and, the various ills of the human condition. It's an all-encompassing freedom to express your real desires and freedom from all the limiting, debilitating conditions we generally experience.
Got it.
Anyway, so he's saying that vision of the freedoms is right, but it should not be fought for. It should just be sided with and argued for. And when he's saying it should not be fought for, he's particularly thinking, of course, about World War II, because the freedoms played a role in us entering World War II.
And you think about all of the horrors of World War II, the Holocaust, the nuclear bombs, all the, I think it was like 70, 75 million casualties, fatalities.
Yeah, I think there were more.
And yet, you have to consider the source here too. This is Jesus who's talking. And didn't he demonstrate this in his own life where he was persecuted? He didn't really fight back. all the way up to his own death when he,
Yeah.
so he was a model of this.
That's a really good point. He didn't just teach nonviolence. When he was basically confronted with paying with his life, he didn't resist. He specifically, told his followers not to defend him with the sword, and he went willingly to his death, and that was his greatest triumph. That's why we know about him, because of his crucifixion and resurrection. So you're right. I mean, he lived out nonviolence to the point of it killing him, and yet that's how he triumphed.
Yeah.
So
And
this is
yet I
hard
can't,
teaching.
right, because I can't imagine thinking, okay, well, let's just peacefully march into the gas chambers. So yeah, I struggle with this.
Yeah, but I think that's the beginning of a conversation, not the end. And I think Gandhi's such a great example because he had a whole positive program, not just the negative program of let's not go to war.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, of course, so did King.
Right.
I've always, I've loved King's philosophy where he's like, we're not going to throw bricks through your windows. We're just going to picket your organization until you start being fair to everyone.
Right. And I think that if the course had its own social movement, I don't know. I don't think it would be, like Gandhi's or like Martin Luther King's in the details. I think there are ways in which it would see certain tactics of theirs as not love. And yet they did take the principle of love and nonviolence and work it out into a social program. And I think that's probably what would need to happen here, because if you just refrain from it, you get creamed, and then we're all saluting Hitler.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. So we should go on.
we should.
But I think at least we're communicating the fact that there aren't easy answers, at least that we know about.
There aren't. No.
Yeah. Okay. So to go on, from the course's standpoint, war is an attack on ourselves, and this comes through just repeatedly in many references in many ways, um, to the point where the course says we don't really want it. We think we want it, but it's so against our interests. It's such a loss without any gain that if we knew our real will, we'd realize that we just don't want it. So, for instance, in the section on above the battleground, the course says this is your part to realize that murder in any form is not your will. So, one of the big forms of senselessness of war in the course is that there's no gain, only loss. Another big form, not referenced as often, is that there's no actual opponent.
Well,
So,
let me pause on this last point, though, for a second, because
mm-hmm.
this feels to me like something we do understand. I think if you ask the highest generals of what do you think about war, no one wants to go there, and yet.
Well, I read a really interesting book by Chris Hedges called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. And it's an anti-war book. He's a journalist that's been stationed around the world, and he's been in countries in the run-up to war, I think many times. And you read the title, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and you think, oh, this is a pro-war book, but it's completely the opposite. The point of the title is what he witnesses in those countries that are getting ready for warfare is a kind of a collective, almost hysteria that's pro-war. Everyone gets caught up in the
Yeah.
pro-war sentiment. And so I don't think what you're saying is actually true.
I
I
know.
think
Maybe
it's
I just want it
one
to be
side of
true.
it.
I know. I was there for the lead up to the Iraq War when everyone
Yeah.
was pounding the drum to go. Um, we like to make these distinctions between what's a just war and what's not a just war. And there's also the industrial military complex where war becomes a profit machine. And so, yeah, I know it's complicated. You would
There's
just go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
There's
go
just
ahead.
there's a feeling you have that you get caught up in that's very similar to the feeling you have when you're rooting for your sports team. It's like you want your team to crush the opponent. And I think that is essentially the exact same impulse that Chris Hedges was observing. You want your team, your country, to crush the opponent. And you identify with the country. You feel like if your country crushes them, then it's elevated and you are elevated with it. And that's that above idea.
I want my country to be moral.
Yeah, but it's in us. It's in us.
I know. But I hear what you're saying. It's an attack on ourselves.
Right. So the other thing is that it's senseless because there's no opponent.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to read this passage because it's important. This is chapter 8, section 1 in the text. Every response to the ego is a call to war. And war does deprive you of peace. Yet in this war, there is no opponent. This is the reinterpretation of reality which you must make to secure peace, and the only one you need ever make. Those whom you perceive as opponents are part of your peace, which you are giving up by attacking them. So and this comes through in lots of passages. He's constantly talking about the opponent being, in some sense, either not an opponent or we've made an image of the other person and that image is unreal. So we're kind of battling with an unreal image that's obviously not actually there.
Yeah. And is that, talk more about that there is no opponent. What does that mean?
Well, I think it means, an enemy is somebody that is against you. If they get their way, your interests will be damaged. Your happiness will be damaged, right? But from the Course's standpoint, other people are actually our brothers. We gain or lose together. So their gain is our gain. And you can't say of somebody with whom their gain is your gain that they're an enemy, right? An enemy is somebody where if they gain, you lose.
Mm-hmm.
That's the nature of enemy. So if their gain means your gain, then they're your friend. That's the nature of friendship, is you have shared interests.
And their loss is your loss.
And their loss is your loss, right? In war, their loss is your gain. Their loss is your victory. So from the Course's standpoint, there is no such thing as actual enemies. And I could have expanded my study by going into all the references to enemies, there's a lot of those. But there's a consistent teaching throughout the Course that there is no real enemy, which means war is senseless, right? Like if you're going to war with an enemy who's not there, who's not your enemy.
You're shadow boxing.
Yeah, and that's crazy.
So in your discussion guide here, you have some of the quotes from the Course that talk about the senselessness of war. Do you want to read some of those?
Well, I'd like to transition into the war imagery in the Course, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because there's two, what I found in looking into this is that there's two really interesting categories for the senselessness. One is the war imagery, where that senselessness really comes through. And the other is the cultural references. And these are not very well known at all. But the same message of senselessness comes through there. And it's just so interesting to see it come out in these different ways. So I wanted to go into some of that. Okay. So probably the most important discussion of war in the Course is above the battleground in chapter 23 in the text. And it's all about how there's no safety on a battleground. You have to rise above it. You have to be above it, and only there can you be safe. And he's talking about, the interpersonal battleground. He's not talking about the literal one. And interestingly, that section is an expansion and kind of meditation on this dream Helen had decades before the Course came through, which she called the blue-gray bird. And in this dream, it takes place in the American Civil War, and there's this blue bird that that is perched on the only tree left standing on a battleground. And the tree's leaning, it's leafless, it's been damaged, it's about to fall over. And the bird won't leave the tree. And in the meantime, it's blue, but it says it's gray, so that whichever size wins, the blues or the grays, they'll think, well, the bird is basically one of us. It thinks it's gray, so that's fine, or it's really blue, so that's fine. And the insanity of the bird is just there throughout the whole dream. And of course, the key insanity is that it's a bird. It could just fly away.
Fly.
And that provides the whole basis for this imagery of this section above the battleground, where, you know, he says, not one tree left standing will shelter you, a total reference to the dream. You have to just rise above the battleground. You can't stay on it. So there you have the uselessness of war, the need to leave the engagement in war, and the almost comical insanity that you see in the blue-gray bird.
Mm-hmm. And it's similar to us. We can leave that mentality at any time that we choose. We have wings of our own.
And we can leave engaging in the battle with others, because we do.
Yeah.
In our own ways, we do.
All the time. And you expand on that dream of Helen's, the blue-gray bird, in a cameo in the back of the CE. Which cameo is it? Do you know?
I think it's 28.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, the interaction between the
favorites.
dream and the section, oh, thank you, is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's one of those little known allusions in the course that really brings out his views on war. Okay, so we also have another image of the army of the powerless. That's his term in chapter 21, section 7.
It's a great term, the army of the powerless.
Yeah. So, and the image is like 4 paragraphs long. It's quite extended for the course. And you have this irrational, chaotic army that runs around after one enemy and then that's switching enemies all the time. Its soldiers forget they have a common cause. They turn on each other and on themselves. And they're powerless. They have no weapons. They have no power. And in that picture is so much of what he's saying about, he's really describing what I think is group behavior in this world, because group behavior is like that. Mm-hmm. Groups will chaotically and irrationally decide on one enemy, fixate on that enemy, and then switch next week to another enemy, and then switch again. And
the individuals in the groups oftentimes don't even know why they have that enemy in the first place. They just know that they do because the group does.
Right. So I think group behavior in the world functions very much like the army of the powerless. And literal armies are groups that function like the army of the powerless. Mm-hmm. I mean, we went after the wrong country after 9/11. You know, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. Yeah. We didn't even know who we were supposed to be against.
Yeah. Okay, so another bit of imagery in the course is the imagery about weapons, which I think is really interesting, because each little reference to weapons, whether it's swords or spears or shields or armor or whatever, I guess armor's not a weapon, but, you know, same kind of thing, is soaked with his overall view of the senselessness of war. So I'll just give you a couple quotes here. He says in chapter 29, and those who serve the Lord of Death have come to worship in a separated world, each with his tiny spear and rusted sword, to keep his ancient promises to die. So think about that quote. We're here in this world, serving the Lord of Death, keeping our ancient promises to die. I guess if you worship the Lord of Death, that's the natural expression of worshiping the Lord of Death. And we're carrying these weapons, apparently to protect ourselves, but it's ultimately to keep our promise to die. And the weapons are not given the kind of sacred respect that we think of giving, especially more ancient weapons. The spear is a tiny spear. The sword's a rusted sword. He's not giving the proper respect to weapons, and never does he do that in the course.
Yeah. But we certainly have a lot of reverence for our weapons, and look at our gun battles here in the United States. And how do you sort of square this with weapons that do real harm? I mean, you think about Hiroshima, for example. I mean, 140 pounds of enriched uranium isn't anything to sneeze at. So we do have weapons that hurt us here, and yet he's calling out the senselessness of it. But what would you say to somebody who's listening and think, but weapons do harm?
Well, he's not so much targeting they don't harm. On this level they do, and he acknowledges that his own body was crucified. um, it's the senselessness is really about their use. He's saying their use ultimately serves a promise you made to die yourself, right? So he's talking about the senseless behavior involved in their use. Let me give you another example, a couple more, really. In lesson 182, he says, take time today to lay aside your shield, which profits nothing, and lay down the spear and sword you raise against an enemy without existence. So you see there, it's like there's the two sides. There's no gain and there's no enemy. So you're using the shield and spear and sword for no gain and against an enemy that's not there. It's senseless behavior. And
To
then
engage in a behavior that, to your point earlier, you don't really want.
you don't really want, and it makes no sense because there's no actual enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of my favorite ones. Lesson 190 in the workbook: lay down the cruel sword of judgment that you hold against your throat. So we think we have the sword of judgment, and that's an image from the Bible, the sword of judgment. And it repeats many times in the course. He often associates judgment with a sword. We think we use the sword of judgment to mow down our enemies, and then we feel better about ourselves, right? But he's saying you hold it against your own throat. So that is senseless behavior. That's irrational behavior. To hold a sword that's supposed to protect you against your own throat. And it's this kind of like almost comical senselessness that you see again and again in these references.
Yeah. Will you read your last one here? It's one of my favorites.
Okay. This is from 192 in the workbook. Every time you feel a stab of anger, realize you hold a sword above your head, and it will fall or be averted as you choose to be condemned or free. So again, you're threatening yourself with harm.
Yeah, I just think that's such an important image, that every time you feel the stab of anger, every time you're judging someone else, to think about that sword that's over your head, not theirs.
Right. And notice that subtle reference to stab of anger.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a saying, of course, that's a term. We're feeling inwardly stabbed by our anger.
It actually
That's his whole point.
physically feels like that, though,
Yeah.
when you're angry.
Yeah. So yeah, the I think the weapon references, I find them very, very interesting. Okay, so let me go on to the next category, which is the cultural references. And they reinforce the senselessness theme as well. So we have the freedoms passage, reference to World War II. Okay. There are two references to the French movie from 1937, The Grand Illusion. And this is a classic movie. I haven't seen it. I want to, but it's regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. There are a surprising number of film references in the course.
Because
And
this is a movie buff.
I think Helen saw movies and they stayed in her mind. So the Grand Illusion celebrates the ability of human warmth and respect to rise above the national boundaries and political divisions that lead to the Grand Illusion, which is the usefulness of war. So that's a reference to the uselessness or the senselessness of war. There's one reference, I think a sentence away from one of the Grand Illusion references, to a movie called The Great Dictator. And it's a 1940 Charlie Chaplin film. It's like his, I think, one and only sound film, or at least his first one, not silent. And it's a total satirical condemnation of Adolf Hitler. And it ends with this stirring speech against war and for universal brotherhood. But Hitler is being satirized in this.
Lampooned.
It's being lampooned, and he does so much of this. You see it with the blue gray bird. You see it with the weapon references. Holding a sword against your own throat. He does a lot of kind of making fun of war behavior as just completely. I mean, senseless behavior is something. That's what we make fun of in this world, right? Senseless behavior.
And it takes the sting out of it, because if you think about Hitler, for example, he wanted to be respected, feared, cowered around, and to have Jesus come and say, this is nothing to be afraid of, because it's nothing at all, is really interesting.
Yeah. And I think that was a lot of Charlie Chaplin's motivation, I'm sure, in making the movie. Okay, another movie reference is The Mouse That Roared. It was first a book and then a movie with Peter Sellers, 1959. And in it, the tiny country of the Duchy of Grand Fenwick or Fenwick decides to declare war on the U.S. with the intention of losing, and I think getting aid. Its army, equipped with bows and arrows, arrives in New York, where the streets have been emptied by a nuclear drill, and wanders about trying to find someone to surrender to. And this is referred to in the discussion of the army of the powerless.
I love this idea. Just the absurdity of it. It's like a Monty Python film.
Right.
Where a country would come in and want to lose just so that the country that they're quote unquote invading would support them.
Right. And
really
that's
funny.
It's easy to miss the reference unless you're familiar with the movie, but isn't it interesting that reference is in there in the Army of the Powerless discussion? Because this army behaves like the Army of the Powerless in significant ways. The last one I want to mention is there are two references to Don Quixote in the course. One is in chapter 4, it's been restored, it's in the CE. The other one is in the manual, just a brief reference to The Impossible Dream, which is from the musical The Man of La Mancha. And in the first reference especially, I mean, they're both negative references to Don Quixote. Now think about it, he doesn't go to war, but he's a knight, right? He's got his armor and his weapon, his spear, and he's engaging in his own little personal war. And from the course's standpoint, well, from our standpoint, we can romanticize that, like The Man of La Mancha did, the musical. From the course's standpoint, he's a lean and foolish man who battles against imaginary giants. There's again the illusory enemy, right? Tilting at windmills. Those aren't giants, they're windmills. In order to puff up his weak ego, he pursues a truly impossible dream. So he's a negative picture in the course, a kind of a cautionary tale of how the ego behaves. He's insane, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the character is insane. So it's a passing reference. There's not a lot to it, just a few sentences. But what's interesting is how much it tallies with the course's other references to warfare. You have insane behavior, you have imaginary enemies, you have an impossible dream, something that can't really be accomplished.
Puffing up the ego.
You're just puffing. That's the better then, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that. So in just this quick reference, you see all these elements that are there in the other war references, and that can't be a mistake or an accident. Okay, so the overall picture. This is what I came to from the whole study, at least on the negative side, the analysis of war. War is not good, but neither is it evil. It is senseless. It doesn't bring gain. There are no real spoils. It doesn't buy us peace or freedom. It just brings loss. It's ultimately a war against ourselves. It is suicidal. There is no opponent. Our supposed opponents are part of our peace. War is not strength, it is weakness. The weapons are not to be valued and respected. They are pathetic toys, he calls them toys more than once, that we use against ourselves. We are not being strong and heroic. We are being foolish, irrational, even comical. We do not really want it. And there's a quote, murder in any form is not your will. So that's what I had to say about the course's analysis of war itself.
My goodness. The course is always asking us, what's it for? And we think that war, we're going to war to fight for some noble cause like freedom, for example. And if you take the cause and then you make the cause senseless, then all of the behaviors that stem from that cause take on their own form of senselessness, as you've pointed out through this whole discussion.
I think what he would say is not so much the cause is senseless, like freedom's a just cause. It's a good, peace is a good cause.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that you won't get it.
By fighting for it.
Right.
So then how do we get it in this view then?
Well, through the course's means. I think, we've acknowledged that we don't really understand.
That's part 2, isn't it?
Yeah, that's part 2. You're right, that's part 2. But I think, we've said we don't really have all the answers when it comes to the international level. But what we're faced with day to day is the interpersonal level. And on that interpersonal level, we have that choice of, do we go to war to achieve our ends, or do we do what can look foolish and self-destructive and refuse to engage in the battle, but use the means of love instead? We face those choices at work, in the family, at home.
And if enough of us get it right at the individual level, then maybe we'll get it right one day at the collective level.
Right. And the things we're saying about like World War II, like, but if we didn't, what would have happened? We say those same things on the interpersonal level. Mm-hmm. Don't we? We say, but I can't just lay down my arms here. What's going to happen if I do? So I think that let's concern ourselves more with those day-to-day things and just hold an open mind about Jesus's vision of the international scene.
Well, yeah, and it's one of those things that we can't go back and change the past, but we can create a happier dream, right? So if we can get it right at this individual level, then maybe we can have a hope of salvation and healing the world.
Right. For instance, I mean, if you had a country in a run-up to war and the populace didn't think this is a force that gives us meaning, they just thought, this is silly. This is irrational. We have no interest in this. What would happen to the actual war?
Mm-hmm.
Right? You need the populace behind you. If the whole populace says this is senseless.
So I wonder if as we move forward, we can stop romanticizing more in our imagery to the point at the beginning of this discussion, then maybe we would not attach so much noble meaning to war and be so quick to go there.
Right, because we do romanticize so many elements of it. And I think part of that is we romanticize violence. Part of it is we don't want to be disrespectful to people who paid with their lives.
Yeah.
But at some point, without disrespecting those people, we need to, I think, face the senselessness of it.
There was an op-ed recently in the New York Times from a soldier who returned from Iraq, and I forget the name of it, but it was like basically the day I discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction. And he was talking about what it was like to take his soldiers into battle, ultimately to realize that the narrative that they were given in which to go into battle was untrue, and what that meant. And so he even, I think he used the word senseless in it. And so you're right. I mean, you don't want to dishonor the efforts and the sacrifices of the soldiers who are fighting these battles for our freedoms. And at the same time, there's so much to think about in terms of why we go to war in the first
Yeah.
place.
And while we're thinking about it, let's not be surprised if the course really has come from Jesus. We know where that guy stood.
Right.
We know what he taught. We know what he did. It's no surprise that he takes a stance like this in the course.
Yeah. Doesn't it just give it more authority that it comes from Jesus in your view? Like, of course
Oh
he
my
would
God.
take this stance. Of
Yeah,
course he
of
would.
course. Yeah, I mean, historically, he's of that second stream to the point where for the first 300 years of Christian history, Christians were pacifists and they did not serve in the armed forces.
Hmm.
300 years. Yeah.
Okay, Robert, I feel like we are going along on this one. So, is there anything else that you want to say before we close?
I think we've kind of said it. I feel like we've done a pretty decent job at hitting the bases. So I'm glad about that. And, we're still thinking about it. So we've left a lot of food for thought in people's laps.
And we'll be back next time for part 2 of this discussion on the senselessness of war. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.